Okay, welcome to the Liminalist live meet number 6, 22nd of the 12th, 2018. 3 days to Christmas. Today's talk is going to be on the second matrix and God as algorithm. I got an email just before this meeting. Somebody asked me about it and asking what was the deal with the second matrix. Was I talking about the movie, which brings home how unfamiliar people are with that term. Well, obviously just this one person, but I've been using the term second matrix for quite some time now, for years, even many years, and obviously it hasn't caught on, which is fine, but I was prompted to make it the subject for today's presentation because I was going through various different aspects of my writing, or elements where I've created models, if you will, for understanding things that are new, things that I've introduced into the newer sphere as interpretations of our reality, let's say. And I came up with various different models, if you like, that I've come up with over the year. Crucial fictions is another, trauma genesis, and so on. I thought it would perhaps be beneficial to myself and to others to explore these one by one. So hence I thought I'd start with the second matrix. I don't want to hem and haw for too long, but I also want to wait until more people show up before I get into the meat of the presentations. I guess that's one of the problems with having this be as loose as it is. But on a practical note, I've decided this week to make the YouTube presentation around an hour long, after which I'm going to move over to Zoom. I'll put a link in the chat area, and now I'm going to shut it down here in YouTube. So and I'll continue in Zoom, and people who want to participate in Zoom, they don't actually have to turn their cameras on or their microphones. I should have set that up in advance, actually, that it'd be automatically muted, but I didn't. But anyway, but so it's more or less the same as YouTube. It can be at your end, but it also gives the option of more direct interaction, and it takes it out of the public live stream and out of the Google AI cloud, which is my main impetus for this, as well as for having a space in which more real-time interaction can occur. All right, so 7 people. It's probably enough to get started. So I guess I will start with a recording. This is a brief excerpt from a book called What Algorithms Want by, I'm not going to try and guess his name because I'll just get it wrong. By Ed Finn is his name. And it's about the gap between theoretical ideas and messy reality as seen in Neil Stephenson, Adam Smith, and Star Trek. So I ordered this. I actually ended up with an audiobook by mistake. I thought I'd ordered the real thing, but I ordered it as part of research for the Kubrickon, which is essentially about a kind of meta-algorithm, as I understand it, the Kubicon. So I've been listening to it anyway, and it of course plays into the idea of a second matrix, so it's relevant. And I will just play an excerpt and probably interrupt it to give some commentary.
The role of the humanities and methodologies of critical reading, algorithmic reading, are vital to effectively contend with the ambiguity and complexity at play in the awkward intersection of computation and culture. This figure of the algorithm as a quasi-mystical structure of implemented knowledge is both pervasive and poorly understood. We have never been closer to making the metaphor of fully implemented computational knowledge real than we are today, when an explosion of platforms and systems is reinventing cultural practice and identity. We are surrounded by namshubs that we obey almost unquestioningly, from the dialogue boxes and prompts we fill out on social media platforms to the arcane computation of credit scores.
So that phrase namshub, that comes from Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash. The namshums are like ideological viruses. They're like a kind of, I think earworm is a more profane description for them. They relate to early religion, and he takes it back to Samaria. And I'm not going to boulderize Neil Stephenson's thing by trying to wing it, so I'll just keep it simple. That the namshub is like a forerunner of computer code or software, in that it transmits via language a certain ideology or a certain program that if a person is vulnerable or susceptible to it, once they hear the word or the phrase that is the namshub, it enters into their consciousness through their hearing, like an earworm, and then it takes over their consciousness and reconfigures them internally, so they become possessed, as it were, ideologically possessed. So that's the idea of the namshub. Continuing.
Consider the popularity of the cathedral as a metaphor for code. Software and cathedrals are much the same. First we build them, then we pray. This was meant as a joke, of course, but it hides a deeper truth about our relationship to the figure of the algorithm today. The architecture of code relies on a structure of belief as well as a logical organization of bits. The house of God that exists beyond physical reality, transubstantiation, relics, and ceremonies are all part of the spectacle of the cathedral that reflect the invisible machinery of faith. Yet most of that machinery inevitably remains hidden. Schisms, budgets, scandals, doctrinal inconsistencies, and other elements of what a software engineer might call the back end of the cathedral are not part of the physical or spiritual facade presented to the world. A cathedral is a space for collective belief, a structure that embodies a framework of understandings about the world, some visible and some not. We have fallen into a computational theocracy that replaces God with the algorithm. Our supposedly algorithmic culture is not a material phenomenon so much as a devotional one, a supplication made to the computers people have allowed to replace gods in their minds, even as they simultaneously claim that science has made us impervious to religion. We have adopted a faith-based relationship with the algorithmic culture machines that navigate us through city streets, recommend movies to us, and provide us with answers to search queries.
Right. There's a bit more of that, but I'll just break to maybe provide some commentary. A computational theocracy. code as cathedral. So, I mean, there's a lot here, and whether I'll be able to bring it together in my own consciousness enough to articulate it remains to be seen. Obviously, doing it live makes it trickier, a little more pressure. That can also help to energize it. Okay, so the intersection between science and religion is here being described, which I've already talked about at length at different places in terms of scientism. And there's a common thread between science and religion and magic, which I'll get to, the third one I'll get to in a moment, which is an attempt to provide an interpretation of reality. Like both religion and science offer an interpretation of reality that claims to be absolute, to be final. It might not be completed, as in Christianity, there's still the revelation, there are still things to unfold. And as with science, certainly there's an acceptance or an admission that things are still being worked out, but there's the promise of a final and complete and an all-encompassing interpretation of reality. And there's also the promise that the method, and I think this is the key really, that the religious method is divine revelation and then scripture, and the theocracy, of course, is the next level down, is itself sound, valid, and complete unto itself. It's all that's required. In the same way, scientism, as I see it, more than science itself, presents the scientific method as sufficient to understand everything, as a sufficient approach to experience and existence unto itself. The notion that logic, and this isn't synonymous quite with scientific method, but I'm just going to try and expand out a little bit. Logic is adequate to every occasion, that logic can meet every mystery or anomaly and find an explanation for it, is itself not logical. And in the same way, a truly scientific method is somewhat paradoxical, would acknowledge that the scientific method itself can't be assumed to be adequate to explain everything. It has to just be a tool, and it may be a multi-purpose tool, but it's still not going to be omni-functional. Like, it may be more functional than a spanner or a hammer or less specific, but still we can't assume that the scientific method is adequate to every occasion. Kind of repeating myself here. Which brings me to magic, which in Crowley terms is the synthesis between religion and science. I think that that's incorrect. I think that what's happened is that occultism has co-opted science in order to turn it into a new religion. I think that that's closer to something, to a correct kind of reading of that triad, at least, improvising. To check back, see what I said later. So here is here's a quote from Charles Upton, anyway, that I found recently in his upcoming book on Dugan. The sort of magic or creative visualization that either believes there is no such thing as an objective metaphysical order, or else has so vague an idea of it that the notion of conforming the self to that order as the precondition for any spiritually based action, has never arisen, thus inevitably emerges as the central practice in a post-structuralist world. So what he's saying there is that the magical belief is that there's no such thing as an objective reality, or just has a vague idea of it conforming to the self. and makes that the precondition of a spiritually based action, has become central to our post-structuralist world. Okay, and this is where I wanted to get to. The notion that belief is a tool, that the use of words is not primarily to express truth, but rather to make things happen, is obviously also an integral part, not only of the craft of magic, but of the practice of politics, right, left, or center, green, red, or blue in today's world. It's also a good description of computing and of code, of the function of code. Belief is the tool that the words not primarily express truth, but make things happen. So computer code doesn't actually describe anything. It's sort of random, but it's functional. If it can be made operational, then it will actually cause things to happen that then represent truth. We could think of even of well, HTML code creates images, or even CGI and so on. Thus, to adopt the worldview of the particular group one wishes to influence, to seize and express the beliefs of that group as a tool for political organizing, without actually believing in them on any level beyond the most basic utilitarianism, is entirely in line with the zeitgeist, not only on the magical paranormal level, but equally on the socio-political one. So this is about occultism, magic, belief in magic, spell casting, and this sort of paradox or conundrum that I've touched on in previous of these meets, which is that belief in magic is necessary to make magic effective. So magic is a tool or a method of manipulating perception that can thereby restructure reality. It's sort of self-confirming, but also self-contradicting, because it depends on the belief, on affirming the belief that there is no objective reality, that there is no higher spiritual principle outside of the psychic realms, which is to say the intersubjective realms that are susceptible to influence by will and by belief. I think that this relates to how the scientific method has stolen the throne of divine revelation, and how occultism has, by aspiring to be a science, or by presenting itself as a sacred science, has infiltrated science, or created what we think of even as Western or conventional consensus science, which is a Trojan horse for occultism, essentially. Now, and what is occultism? The will to power, the imposition of belief onto reality in order to make it conform to our preferences, something like that. How does this relate to algorithms? Well, algorithms are, let me think. They could, one way to define them, I believe, is a set of symbols that function to interpret reality, combined with a computational model that will measure the changes in reality. And magic is the art and science of using will to bring about change. So you could say that occultism is about gathering knowledge, which is to say a system of beliefs, really, a set of symbolic beliefs, in such a way that they can be used, that system can be used to affect change within the world that's being interpreted or reinterpreted through that system of knowledge. All right, so hopefully that made some sense. I'm feeling a little more hyper than usual. I need to relax and breathe a little bit, because I think I'm because I'm trying something slightly different again today, which is kind of a more structured lecture type thing. Here's the next bit.
The house of God that exists beyond physical reality, transubstantiation, relics, and ceremonies are all part of the spectacle of the cathedral that reflect the invisible machinery of faith. Yet most of that machinery inevitably remains hidden. Schisms, budgets, scandals, doctrinal inconsistencies, and other elements of what a software engineer might call the back end of the cathedral are not part of the physical or spiritual facade presented to the world. A cathedral is a space for collective belief, a structure that embodies a framework of understandings about the world, some visible and some not. We have fallen into a computational theocracy that replaces God with the algorithm. Our supposedly algorithmic culture is not a material phenomenon so much as a devotional one, a supplication made to the computers people have allowed to replace gods in their minds, even as they simultaneously claim that science has made us impervious to religion.
Okay, yeah, I was just repeating that for those who weren't here before. Actually, I didn't realize, but I think it's not a bad idea that I replayed it. And here's the last and final section.
When we imagine algorithms as a pinnacle of Enlightenment, rationalist thought, our engagements with them function in a very different mode. Through black boxes, cleanly designed dashboards, and obfuscating application program interfaces, we are asked to take this computation on faith. The commodification of the Enlightenment comes at a price. It turns progress and computational efficiency into a performance, a spectacle that occludes the real decisions and trade-offs behind the mythos of omniscient code. And we believe it because we have lived with this myth of the algorithm for a long time, much longer than computational pioneers Alan Turing or even Charles Babbage and their speculations about thinking machines. The cathedral is a pervasive metaphor here because it offers an ordering logic, a superstructure or ontology for how we organize meaning in our lives. The problem we are struggling with today is not that we have turned computation into a cathedral, but that computation has increasingly replaced a cathedral that was already here. This is the cathedral of the Enlightenment's ambitions for a universal system of knowledge. When we juxtapose the two, we invest our faith into a series of implemented systems that promise to do the work of rationalism on our behalf, from the automated factory to automated science. Computation offers a pathway for consilience, or the unification of all fields of knowledge into a single tree, an ontology of information founded on the idea that computation is a universal solvent that can untangle any complex system, from human consciousness to the universe itself.
To the universe itself. So that's clearly the unified principle there, the desire to unify all knowledge. We can trace that back to the Enlightenment. The person speaking, I don't know who this is a question in the chat. I don't know who did the recording, but they're reading from the book What Algorithms Want by Ed Finn. So yeah, the Enlightenment, unification of knowledge, the creation of a system of knowledge that synthesizes all symbolisms, symbols, symbologies, the one world religion of scientism can be traced back to Enlightenment, presumably further back than that. And I think that it's sort of taking a concretized or a visible or observable or a manifest form through the computerized superstructure of the world now, the global village in McLuhan's term, and the idea of the algorithm. Obviously, it's more than an idea. We're seeing the algorithm in action now. We're becoming, as I said in my last chat with Boyce, we're becoming algorithmic ourselves. Thinking you should start a group called the Al Gore Rhythm Band. So this seems to be my own sort of recurring preoccupations with systems of knowledge, systems of belief, and I think that they're synonymous essentially. Certainly, we create a system of knowledge and then we believe in it. We believe that it's complete or that it's accurate, just as we create a map and then we refer to it. But if we refer to it too much and cease checking the territory and checking the map against the territory, we end up lost, and we end up compounding the error by pretending that there is no territory, that the map is all we need. I know that metaphor doesn't quite break down if we think of literally using a map on the territory, but we think of Google Earth or something, or indeed the virtual realm that we've created is very similar to that. It's again a kind of literalization of taking the map for territory. We're more and more taking computerized virtual interaction for real live interaction as a substitute for it, equivalent to it, and eventually better because it's safer and easier. Because if you're just referring to the map, you're basically living in your imagination, really. You don't ever have to check it. You don't ever have to find out the reality about the terrain that you're imagining that you're traversing. So this, as I say, is kind of my overriding interest, or one of them, is what happens when we create systems of knowledge, and how does that, or how is that playing into a kind of delusion or dementia, and reinforcing it and magnifying it to this in this exponential way, so that we, and the thing about the interesting thing, the paradox about systems of knowledge, is that they're designed to help us navigate terrain, experience, to understand it better, so that we can live better lives. So they're designed to help us get free of things, to solve problems and to improve things. But the more immersed we get in a system of knowledge, the more we convince ourselves that it's infallible and complete, the more trapped we become by that system of knowledge. Hence, the notion of the second matrix was initially my the model that I came up with was the second matrix. It was inspired by, I'm just not going to check the comments for a moment, the rumors about Matrix Reloaded, that all the scenes in Zion, which were even worse than the rest of the movie, bad as that movie was, seemed so kind of bogus, and they were so disappointing that there was this rumor that Zion was itself a matrix, and that it had been designed to trick people like Neo and Morpheus, who might actually genuinely be awakening into a false awakening. So they would think that they were unplugging and entering reality, but in fact they were just being migrated into another layer of the illusion. That was the basic idea. It was never developed by the movies, but I retained awareness of it, and I later applied it to the alternate perceptions community field, the New Age movement, generally, of course what's now gone mainstream, but what was once the subculture, people who were rejecting the consensus view of things and trying to find an alternate model for understanding reality, an alternate set of interpretations. So on the one hand, you've got New Age stuff, and on the other hand, you've got paranoid awareness and conspiracy theories about the underlayer of reality, and got them synthesized in somebody like David Icke, who would be like a very exemplary second matrix architect. Whitley Strieber obviously has explored in Prisoner of Infinity. I'll just check the comments real quick. Okay, so somebody's asked about Gordon White, but I'm just going to, well, maybe I could mention him. I'm just wondering if White might be controlled opposition, thoroughly disenchanted with Bohemia. I can't cite White as an example of second matrix with much authority because I don't listen to him. I have a personal altercation with him which makes me distrust him. It's quite trivial, though. There's certainly no evidence of his any dodgy affiliations. However, whether he knows it or not, Gordon White is a second matrix architect because he propounds occultism. And as for that being controlled opposition, I would say yes. Well, by definition, isn't it? That's exactly what controlled opposition is the second matrix model. It's when the king would create a resistance in order to recruit all the potential dissidents within his kingdom. So I can't say much about Gordon White because I can't say the specifics. But from what I have seen and heard, the clues, the indications are all there. Bardo Fay says, we're trapped by systems of knowledge to the extent that we do not know that they are human constructs or maps superimposed upon reality. To that extent, false awakenings will be in the majority. Kate Mitchell says, in the absence of inner light, man defaults to the mechanical mode of being. Codes of language ensnared him long ago, algorithmically directed him long ago. So, yes, all of this does map inward to some sort of implant or trauma. I guess it's a trauma code that was installed in us by formative experiences. But for now, I was just trying to map the large external picture that we're staring at now. And the intersection between religion and science that is being addressed in these audios, as in that the algorithm is the cathedral of our time. And in a similar way to religion, it requires faith. Like we're putting our faith, we're putting our trust in algorithms to determine our decisions now, which is very much what ancient man did with religion. And it's a little bit confusing, to me at least, because which is the original model? Is it religion or is it science? Well, because if you go back to ancient Egypt, it seems as though they had sacred science and their religion was a scientistic kind of religion. Anyway, I want to get stuck on trying to work out the unworkoutable, but I think the point is that, as somebody just said in the comments, that and it's kind of, it is complicated because it ends up being self-cancelling, but the religious idea of divine revelation doesn't really allow for systems of knowledge, and yet at the same time it's the origin of systems of knowledge. Divine revelation, a system of knowledge that puts divine revelation at the apex of it, is essentially saying that in order to know anything, we need divine revelation. But in order to know that, there needs to be the scripture that was received through divine revelation telling us that essentially you can't trust scripture. Now, the Bible doesn't say that. It doesn't say you cannot trust this book, because that would be self contradictory and self-sabotaging to a large extent. It has to say the opposite. But then, of course, the Bible has been rewritten and it's been tampered with and so on and so forth, which doesn't mean there isn't some basic code in there which is still valid. Neil Stephenson's idea about the Namshub, or part of it anyway, was that it was possible to there was a certain language technology that made one resistant to Namshubs. And Girard has a similar idea about the Bible and the Gospel, that it contains a kind of super code or super software that actually clears out all of the malware. And I have to say I'm skeptical. It does sound like the old promise again. But on the other hand, I'm doing these talks, so it does seem as though I do believe that we can use a nail to drive out a nail. That there's a way of approaching knowledge and systems of knowledge, and we can't talk or have a conversation without referring to a system of knowledge and relying on it. But there is a way to do so that actually leads to the escape hatch, that leads us away from reliance on systems of knowledge without rejecting the systems outright, because then that just creates a sort of feedback loop where we get stuck on the nail, I suppose. I mean, this is obviously in the metaphor. The basic danger in using a nail to drive out a nail is you just replace one nail for another. So it requires a deafness of hand and eye by which that doesn't happen. It requires actually applying knowledge in such a way that we can see the limits of knowledge without re-reifying the knowledge that we're using to see those limits. And I feel like I wish I could be doing stand-up at this point, because it's so convoluted and absurd that to take it seriously seems to be counterproductive. That seems to fall into the snare that somehow this is all really serious stuff that we're talking about, and we need to work it out and figure out the way out of the matrix, man. Well, in a certain sense, there isn't a way out of the matrix, because to the extent that we're living in a simulacrum created by these namshubs of ideologically generated, simulations of belief that concretize into systems of knowledge, so far as we're made of that code, we can't leave it. If we leave it, we disappear. And then by the same token, if we're not made of that code, we're not trapped in the matrix to begin with. So what traps us is our identification with the code that we've taken in order to deal with infinite, eternal streams of information. Even the word information is compromised, of course, because that belongs to a system, but so does any word that I would use. So there's the potentially hilarious conundrum of talking about the need to let go of language, and language in its different forms, from literally to more figuratively and symbolically, as in a system of symbols that we use to interpret reality and measure change within reality, that then becomes the algorithm or the code that we download into our bodies. There's a whole bunch of comments there. Just before I read, I'm going to reiterate for those who who went here at the beginning. I'm going to keep this up for maybe a little over an hour, and then I'm going to go over to Zoom. I'll post the link in the chat, and then I'll close the window on YouTube. And on Zoom, you don't have to be seen or heard either, but there is that possibility. And I'll record it on Zoom and then possibly upload it later. Okay, there's lots of comments here, so I'm going to read them. In the absence of inner light, man defaults to the mechanical mode of being. Codes of language ensnared him long ago, algorithmically directed him long ago. I'd say the modern assessment of the lack of anything greater than the self is leading people straight into the gutter. There's nothing to strive for if there's nothing beyond and greater than us. Yeah, maybe come back to that. Even if it's BS, it is incredibly important. Kate Mitchell, we can't identify the fall, but we can see how we can find conditions where we are not conscious, and by this identify the start creation within ourselves. Best shot we've got, he who knows the beginning. He who knows the beginning, ... knows the end. Chris, but if it's not something you automatically place at the apex of your knowledge worldview, then it's not actually divine or a revelation, right? As well, one man's divine revelation is another man's delusion. This is the problem that we all face in terms of looking to external authorities to help guide us, because we can't live without them, we can't live with them, essentially. They represent or embody knowledge, the trap of knowledge. If we turn to somebody who seems to have access to higher knowledge than we do, we can benefit, but we can also end up trapped by the idea that we need to refer outside of ourselves. We can't ever gauge if somebody's divine revelation is true, and certainly not from scripture, which is of course concretized and so far removed from the source. But even if we have direct interaction, and someone like Dave O'Shana isn't claiming divine revelation anyway, but of course the idea of enlightenment does suggest a kind of insight that transcends that's accessible to the ego or the constructed identity. But I would say that the problem with divine revelation itself is in the concept itself, because it creates a pyramid. And it creates the idea that divine revelation is something that only happens to a few, that it only happens sometimes, and that there are key moments and that religions come out of those moments. That last part is clearly true, but how useful has that been is definitely up for debate. Like the divine revelations, if they were such, were of great value, and there can still be value in those words, but they also cause religions to form and all kinds of atrocities to be committed in the name of that belief, that pyramid, and the slaves that had to be enlisted to build the pyramid and that continue to be. Like we'll have our own pyramid building, inner life, where we enslave parts of our consciousness constantly and endlessly to maintaining the pyramid of our crucial fiction, whatever's at the pinnacle of it, whether it's divine revelation or whether it's the scientific method. That's the pharaoh that rules our fate. And it's not accurate, I believe, that divine revelation is anything but a moment-to-moment thing that is always happening to all of us all of the time. Which kind of begs the question, well, what's so divine or revealing about it? Well, that is the question. We've managed to lock ourselves up in the pyramid like dead pharaohs, and so we're the last to actually benefit from the hierarchy that we've constructed. Okay. We don't have... Oh, wait. I'll skip that. Where does this newfound mania for psychedelics factor into this notion of second matrix and false awakenings? Well, it does directly, because psychedelics are what's on offer for self-manifested divine revelation. If you listen to Jordan Peterson, that's the model that he's presenting is divine revelation is real, but we don't really know quite what it was or is, and in order to approach it scientifically, take psychedelics, and then you even have charge of your divine revelation. Well, the paradox in that is so obvious, so blatantly obvious, that it boggles my mind that Jordan Peterson doesn't get laughed off the stage for this kind of thing. Not to make it about Jordan Peterson, but just as an example of this kind of double thing that crucial fictions make de rigueur. Because if we can engineer our own revelation through psychedelics, then how is it divine? It's not an intervention at all. And I think, the second matrix is all about keeping us disembodied, so that we keep going from conceptual prisons to conceptual prisons. And psychedelics they're like pathogens to fuel the constructing of second matrix bardo realms, because they hijack the energy of the body and of the psyche, but it's the same thing, and siphon it off into these compartmentalized realms that are disembodied. And so they suck the life force out of us physically and then redirect that life force into the matrix. It's exactly like in the movie, actually. Obviously not literally exactly, but metaphorically exactly. We don't have enough gathered attention to see all we know within us in its proper place. That would constitute objective knowledge, and that would entail a different mode of being. Yes. Without it, we are magnetically attracted to systems of knowledge narratives. We try to fix some code into place. Yeah, it's a substitute. Chris is responding to the psychedelics question. It depends if you buy the idea that psychedelics are boundary dissolvers, or that they reduce the limiting filters of sensory input, or if it's just the nonsense output of a fried mind, or both and, as I describe in Prisoner of Infinity without referencing psychedelics. Identification is precisely the problem, becoming identified with patterns of code, but we must ask what state of being makes that possible. Define your own cosmology without turning your back on the grand narrative. Guard yourself before consuming new information. Be wary. Oswald. Jason, if you weren't aware, it's possible to stream the Zoom meeting on YouTube. I didn't know that. I can look into that, but I think it would defeat the point, which is to move away from YouTube gradually. Mind blown. It's about finding the divine in every passing moment. That is a revelation. Good. Well, if somebody had a revelation, just don't give me any credit. Could it be that we each possess a divine spark such that intermediaries aren't required? Divine. No. Well, I don't like this term divine spark anymore, because it's Jordan Peterson's thing, and it's that woman I played last week. It's the Gnostic idea. It's been co-opted. It's been second matricized. And maybe the focus is wrong. I think the focus is wrong because, certainly it plays into this notion that we can be as gods, which both the serpent and Yeshua said. So it's not as though that idea is wrong or inherently sinister, but it clearly is a bait for the superego. That is what the superego aspires to be, is a god in its own right. And it's just not useful, I don't think, to I suppose if we're going to refer, it depends. It can be useful. If we're going to refer to divine or divine sparks or any of that, or revelations, how soon and how effectively can we bring it back to the body? How soon, how effectively, how honestly can we, when we refer the map to the territory, check the map with the territory? Because if not, then we're gravitating more and more to the conceptual. We always have a natural orientation to move towards the conceptual and to keep embellishing on the conceptual, to keep rearranging the furniture of our crucial fiction conceptual second matrix realm, because then we don't have to be in our bodies where the distress is, where the buried trauma is, to experience the pain and the anguish of fragmentation, rather than the pseudo empowerment of fragmentation, which we achieve or maintain or enjoy by always moving towards the empowered fragment, by empowering one fragment and putting all our eggs in that one basket, and then going off to the imaginal marketplace, like Jack with his beans. He was coming, of course. Hey, Pablo, that's a nice surprise. I just have to catch up on the missed one. Give meaning to the mundane. Instead, the task is to gain skill at accessing our own divinity and challenging supposing intermediaries. Yeah, I guess. I mean, that seems to be my process to a large extent. Maybe a religion of well-gardened individual crucial fictions. Pablo says, hello, Jason. I think the psychedelics can open your mind up to a certain level. It's like building a castle in the air. When you come back, you know that what you have seen exists. Then you have to build the stairs. I can't disavow my psychedelic experience, especially not with Pablo, who's Guatemalan compadre, who I tried to blow his mind with psychedelics. So sorry about that, Pablo. I mean, I'm trying I'm still doing penance for those days, and so as one tends to do, I have pulled quite far in the other direction to try and correct the imbalance there. And now I'm very down on psychedelics, but that doesn't mean, that's more for people who are thinking about doing them or doing them more or what have you. Like if you've already done them, really, you've probably done enough. If you haven't done them, really, I don't recommend it. But for those of us who have done them, I'm not saying, oh, that was a bad idea, you should regret it. So it's not, obviously, there's nothing to be gained by regretting it. Maybe we're canaries in the coal mine. What Paolo's describing there, I'm on the fence about. Yes, I did see things that seem more real than real through psychedelics, and no, I'm not ruling out the possibility that they were really real. I think that they did represent some reality that I wouldn't have been able to glimpse without psychedelics, but I did glimpse them through psychedelics, which means that in my understanding, I hacked into my psyche and I attacked, or those substances attacked my nervous system and released and redistributed energy in such a way that I'd get this blast of unprocessed information and unearned revelation. And so the toll that took is commensurate to or proportionate to what I saw. And I think more to the point I was trying to make, I don't really know how well I was able to interpret that reality, because I certainly wasn't able to process it. So then how does that represent a real glimpse of reality? And then the third point really is that, do I want to build a ladder to get back there, or build the stairs? Nice metaphor, actually, because I'm in my attic, or I did build the stairs. The answer is yes and no, because I don't know why I'd want to get back to that state, except that it felt really good to my ego, like I came back and I thought, woohoo, that was an incredible realm, and it gave me lots of stories to tell, and it did feel, yes, more exciting and more epic than my regular life. But it didn't actually help me to live. Those experiences didn't essentially help me to live. Or at least, because I felt something passing over the top of my head there, like, I'm not sure what that was, but it was a doubt. Let's say a doubt passed over my head. The jury's still out in terms of how helpful those experiences have been. Maybe they have given me a deeper felt sense of the reality of the divine. But maybe I was tricked. Maybe I encountered a surrogate or a counterfeit. So yeah, I'm going to leave that on a question mark. It's kind of a specific question about psychedelics, but it can be applied generally as well in terms of the things that we do and the methods that we discover and employ to recalibrate our experience of reality and to transform ourselves, supposedly. And how it always seems to be geared towards getting out of the mundane, the first matrix, because we've come to see that there's more to reality than we think. We somehow then extrapolate that reality is elsewhere, or that reality is so drastically different that we need radical interpretations, radical methods, radical belief systems, or radical states to get free of this other realm. But actually what oppresses us in this realm is also what makes it real, like death, age, old age, money problems, health problems, people, all this ordinary difficult stuff, the stuff we want to transcend. That's where the real essence of being here is. That's where the incarnation happens. Like if you read the gospel, Jesus, he wasn't having a party, he wasn't eating mushrooms, unless you believe some versions. He wasn't even having that many revelations. Actually, most of it was hanging out, talking, interacting, getting, pissing people off, getting pissed off, and then getting crucified. It was a difficult life he had, and it was difficult for those around him. It wasn't a Burning Man affair. And that's just the gospel. So imagine how much more it'd be if you're actually there, as opposed to reading the highlights. Empowering a false fragment versus touching true, useful, grounded embodiment seems like a fine line. I guess there's an art in finding that distinction. Other practices or techniques you like, me like. The only one that comes to mind is just checking in with my body. And doing these meets has been interesting in that regard, because I've noticed myself being more able to do that, or rather being more alert to changes in my body while I'm talking, and how they are constantly bringing me back to the moment and keeping me on track. Like the body is the receptacle for the whole psyche. It's the only place that the whole psyche can reside. So the less we are in tune with our body, the more we are going to be identifying with a fragment and feeding and being fueled by a fragment. It's not a false fragment, it's that it's a fragment pretending to be a whole. That's the thing. The fragment would be real as a fragment. There's nothing wrong with epic fun, surely. Well, I'll take that as tongue-in-cheek, because I think most of my output has been pointing out what's wrong with epic fun, unless you want to live in a Marvel universe, or the Marvel universe. There's more than one now. Eckhart Tolle, I did Iboga and I loved the plant itself, but the very dubious shamans that ran the retreats was a trip unto itself, I bet. Well, I don't know if you can separate the experience from the set and the setting myself. I think that would be part of the false map that we have for understanding our experiences. We want to always compartmentalize, say, well, the ayahuasca is good, but the shamans were charlatans. I think that it's all one. I think one psychedelic experience is a good icebreaker. Don't pursue it, but it's good to shake up. So yeah, I can't argue against that. There probably are millions of people that would be better off, at least other people around them would be better off if they had a psychedelic experience, as in that it would loosen them up and make them less insufferable. I'm sure that's possibly true. But I'm talking to a select specific audience now. Chris says, I want to do that for the longest time. As you say, it seems like a minefield, so hard to do properly and purely. Okay. Pablo says, it is interesting to see that lately there are scientists that think that the chances we live in a virtual are actually higher than the chances. I know. I'm going to talk about that at some point. Obviously, it's very relevant. It's symptomatic. I mean, it's a literalization or an absolute visible symptom of what I'm talking about. Is if you refer to the map more and more and less to the territory, you will end up believing there is only a map. And then you will say that the territory is the map. The territory is just a map. So the more we get into this algorithmic state of consciousness, the less and less we're able to experience the living reality of spirit and matter, of soul and body, that is outside this confined black iron prison of the mind, of the concept realm. And so, of course, that part comes up with its own rationale, never to have to leave, by saying, this is all there is. I will reign in hell. Because outside of here, well, heaven seems like hell. Because it will be so overpowering to that part of us that wants control. There's no way to have control over the infinite. It's like getting to heaven and trying to make God shine your shoes, to turn God into your bitch. It's just not going to happen. So then better to stay out of that realm entirely, and then over time convince ourselves that it doesn't exist. And we do that with our bodies. I mean, that is actually, that's the metaphor for what we're literally doing with our bodies. We're moving further and further away from them, and we're telling ourselves that they finally, that they don't even exist, because we're just consciousness off in some simulated realm. Do the people who claim about we're living in a simulation, do they have a hypothesis about where our real bodies are? No, of course they don't, because they would sound like idiots if they started to try and hypothesize where our real bodies are. They would sound like the idiots that they are. But if we're in a simulation, either we are code that is simulated too, in which case you might as well drop it, because it's all irrelevant at that point, game over, or our bodies are somewhere else and we're going to figure out how to get back to them. Maybe some of these guys are starting to say that. I'd like to see it, because of course looking and sounding ridiculous is no longer an obstacle in today's world. It's almost a prerequisite for having any kind of influence, I suppose. Gibb says, is there a horror film about New Age tourists taking a bad trip in South America yet? Yeah, maybe. They were shaking rattles, bells outside our windows. Didn't mean to get us on the site tangent. I'm just aware of seeing very mainstream social media mavens promoting. No, it's a good subject. They were on the route power 247 like it was organic meth. Chris, Jesus would shine your shoes, he'd wash your feet. Yes, well, Jesus, I didn't mean that God. I meant the Father, not the Son. Anyway, I don't think Jesus would do it if you said, yo, shine my shoes, bitch. Thanks for the video you did, Jason, on the film review about Hollywood conspiracy culture. I liked your idea of revelation, the revelation method. In your view, who or what is at the top? All right, well, it would almost be a good cliffhanger and say, well, I'll tell you at Zoom. Come over to Zoom and I'll tell you who's on top. I think it's David Icke, actually. If we were merely code, why would that make anything less meaningful? I'm not sure, viewed through a certain lens, that we are much besides code. If we were merely computer code, I mean, they're not using it as a metaphor, are they? Because then it would be a very different kind of thing. But if we were literally machine code, well, it would still be game over, because there's nothing you can do about it. So either you go insane or you embrace it. Now, to a certain extent, that's true of existence. Well, it is true. Either you go insane or you embrace it. Or maybe you either stay insane or you go a different kind of insane, or you embrace it and you become at peace with the conundrum or the paradox of eternity incarnate, or the infinite incarnating. I have a sort of thought pulling on the edges of my consciousness now, because it was the thing I wanted to get to. Oh, that's right, it was causality. So I'm just going to probably round up now in the next 10-15 minutes. By the way, on Zoom, I'm limited to 40 minutes. I can always restart, but it will end after 40 minutes. So what I'll probably do is just go over to Zoom for one session of 40 minutes, and then that'll be that. So causality. Now, I thought of this because of the specific of paranoid awareness. Who's at the top of it all? Kind of, there's this grand pyramid of conspiracy. Everything's being controlled. That idea starts to fall down once you start to see the depth and the reach of social, cultural engineering and psychological fragmentation and all the rest of it, trauma genesis, because the whole idea of existence being structured in such a way that there are agents within agencies that have agency manipulating other masses and individuals who do not, who have had their agency stolen from them. And the simple idea of causality, i.e. that groups and agendas are causing these social events, that itself breaks down if we start to see that this is the prison that we have been lured into via the supposed conspiracy, is also the one that gives us the interpretation of our situation, including that of a grand conspiracy. So there's basic ideas about causality, agency, individuality, which of course are very central, wherever you stand on them, to your interpretation of reality and of yourself. And it occurred to me that dichotomy between religion and science, divine revelation and scientific method, could also be extrapolated out as between fate and free will. And ironically, it is science, or scientism, I believe, well, I guess it's kind of both and, but first pass anyway, that promotes the idea of fate, because we're determinate. It's all determinism. We're just our genes, our neurons, and so on. We're just the matrix self, which is just brains firing, brainwaves firing and telling us that there's a will, but there really isn't. Hence, we're just in a simulation. Got no free will, no agency, no nothing, no individuality, no existence. Whereas religion is saying the opposite. It's saying that we're created in God's image and God has given us free will, and that the ultimate attainment of free will is divine revelation, which is the recognition of our being made in God's image and being incarnations of the divine, the recognition of Christ, and our participation in the body of Christ. And yet, paradoxically, of course, that is a surrendering of individuality and really being absorbed into our fate, more like destiny, but still, which is to return to God. So there's a duality there, which is really a dog chasing its tail, I guess. I did have more said about that, actually, but let me just check my notes real quick. I just have a few. The drive to explain everything is consistent throughout both perspectives. When we create a system to explain experience, we become trapped by it. Well, I've already said that, but I think that this is the core conundrum that we're faced with, that both science, the scientific method, and religion, divine revelation, do become traps. And I think they become traps when they renege on their own principles. So scientism, actually, by raising up the scientific method to the apex of a pyramid that is supposed to represent all of existence, it betrays itself, because a truly rigorous scientific method would leave space for things that cannot be understood through the scientific method. In other words, for divine revelation, it has to allow, and not by saying, hey, just eat some psychedelics. There has to be a religious impulse that enters into the cognitive appliance of the scientific method somehow that isn't scientism. So that's the first betrayal. That's the betrayal of science that becomes scientism. It's actually the second betrayal. The first betrayal would be a betrayal of religion that becomes occultism. I think it must be. I mean, I haven't obviously worked this out, but religion betrays itself, as I said before, by turning divine revelation into dogma, which contradicts. It breaks the covenant of divine revelation. It can't not do it. That's the irony there. Except it can do it one way, which is by putting its money where its mouth is, and letting go of the need for continuity of transmission, for establishing the word of the divine revelation, the word of God in the world at a social level, because that goes counter to the divine revelation that all is God, all is eternal, all is unchanging, and that this world, well, I don't know actually. I mean, there's all kinds of, I get into the specifics there, but there are definitely things in the gospel that make it clear that forming a religion and joining a religion is not part of what Yeshua was bringing into the world. It was a ripple effect of it and a shadow effect, but it wasn't actually integral to the mission. Paradoxically, however, it was inseparable from it. And I'm not sure how to reconcile that paradox. I think it's the same paradox I've been saying today. Gather people together and talk about how to get free of language. The transmission needs to travel. I mean, it will travel. It's going to travel. And so it automatically creates vessels or media through which to travel, such as language, such as technology, such as algorithms, such as religions. But they're Trojan horses. They're the opposite of Trojan horses. They look like they're weaponized, cultural, Namshub, psychic attack squadrons. Inside of them, there is the kernel of the true transmission, or the transmission that is simply getting around any way it can. And I suppose that's our task then, is to crack open enough of those systems to rediscover the transmission within ourselves. Because if we discover it inside some war engine of religion or scientism or whatever, we're really discovering it in ourselves. The divine revelation is always in the eternal present, so it never actually gets incorporated into the ideological delivery device that forms around it. It's very paradoxical, isn't it? It can't be incorporated into it because it's trans-temporal. Okay, so I'm going to wind up here and move over to the other space. Pablo says, if we are artificial intelligence, it means we are still discovering our potential, maybe that of the universe through us. Yes. Well, I reject the if. We're not artificial intelligence. We know that. I mean, I just don't. I think at a certain point, mind games just become mind games. I mean, they become viruses. They act like viruses that just eat up our consciousness. But I mean, if you want to argue for the positives of artificial intelligence model, sure, but that also cancels it out in the end. Because if it's artificial intelligence is doing that, it's not really artificial intelligence. It's sentient and it has an internal life force drive. yes, but there is power that is wielded by powerful people. There are people like Edward Bernays that clearly have influence and control people. Now, that's relevant, surely, to finding an English. Well, of course, I find all that stuff relevant, absolutely. But if I want to be a plumber or a carpenter, I've got to learn about those things. And yes, I can build things, but none of that is really specific to how I reconnect to my divine essence, to my soul, or allow it to reconnect to me. They're just means. So it could be plumbing, could be carpentry, could be conspiracy, could be theosophy, could be not theosophy actually, but whatever. It could be many different things. So, but the actual data or the nail strikes or the techniques we learn themselves they're just means to an end. Is what I'm saying. These things are relevant to me, but they're not relevant in and of themselves. Trying to control the infinite is like going to heaven and telling God to shine your shoes. Okay, I'm being quoted there. If we are ever to move away from the grotty human tendencies that blight the endeavor for scientific truth, bias, groupthink, lying, forgery, dunning, Krugerism, stupidism, projection, theft, then any discussion regarding the epistemological worth of the scientific method cannot ignore Gödel's incompleteness theorems and Kern's take on the paradigm. Well, this one can, because I've never heard of either of those. Oswald, love the Benjamin Voice Limlinalist. You should try live streaming on YouTube and always guests like that who would be willing to. Yeah, I could do. Pablo says, I honestly don't believe there is anything artificial anywhere. Yeah, I know what you mean. But I do believe that what we consider AI might become the next kind of sentient being, that we may become the next dinosaurs. I only go there in the sense that something is becoming manifest through technology that was always been there and has always been sentient, and that informs our own consciousness, or is our own consciousness, really. So I go there, but then I see the technology as a chrysalis or an egg that has to be destroyed or will collapse as that emerges. It's not as though we're going to be existing in some future machine world, and human beings will be the dinosaurs to that. The human form is, in my view, the eternal image of the divine, and nothing will ever change that. And it's Satan's job to try, of course, to oust that. And of course, Satan will do his best job at that, and it will all play into the hands of the great unfolding of what we really are, I suppose. I mean, I trust that. I have faith. But even consistent with the narrative, with the religious narrative, even without divine revelation, you can't have an equality between good and evil. You can have the illusion of them, and that's the only shot that the satanic wing has at, is creating the illusion of equality, which then creates the possibility of the victory of the dark, so to speak. Our own subjective consciousness is a manifestation of the universe. All right then. So I'm right on time. I said an hour and 20 minutes. So what I'm going to do now is open the Zoom. Well, first of all, I will copy 66. I'll copy the link into here. Then what I will do is I will close here. I will go take a bathroom break, which will take 2 minutes. There's a question there, but I'm going to have to ignore it. And I will open up the Zoom in 2 minutes. I don't want to open it up right now because it's only 40 minutes. But what will happen is if you try to join, you'll get a message saying, wait for the host to start the meeting. And as soon as I start it, you will be in there. All right. So hopefully at least a couple of people will be there. I think they will, because I've spoken to a couple. And as I say, there's no obligation to speak or be seen. But you will still be able to text questions if you prefer to remain in an invisible space. But you can also go the full Monty and let me see who you are. Oh, I also want to ask, if you've enjoyed today's meet, please consider supporting me in future meets. Make a donation to PayPal. You find a link at the website, and or buy one or two of my books. Or if you're really a bit too hard up for any of that, or you already feel like you've done it, you could just comment and just offer your support that way. All right. Thanks everyone for showing up, and I will see those of you who wish to be there on Zoom at the link in about 2 minutes. Bye for now.